Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Steffler coming to you live from Mr. Steffler's room in room 111 at Clintondale Middle School. Proud day to be a Dragon. I'm very excited to be here and talk about this year's midterm. This is going to be one of two videos to talk about our midterm. It's going to be a 30-question multiple choice test, and this test is going to test things that were from Chapter 6 all the way up through Chapter 14. All of these questions you have seen at least once before. You've taken a pre-test with these questions, and I have your test results. And you've also seen these questions on your chapter tests, except that the order of the questions and the order of the answers has been jumbled so that you're going to have to remember the answers. So let's start out on what we're going to be talking about first, Chapter 6. We're going to have some questions about the Declaration of Independence, why it was written, what it's about, who wrote it, our possible questions, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that we endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this stuff is going to be on the test. The olive branch petition that we tried to send to King George to stop the war and to have peace, that's going to be on the test. Chapter 7 is going to be represented by a couple of questions about the strengths and weaknesses of the armies of the British and the United States during the American Revolution. Obviously, the British had more stuff. They had better food, better equipment, more training. We basically had better leaders, and that's pretty much it. And we won the war by sheer determination, and that's going to be on the test. Chapter 8 questions that are going to be on there are going to involve the Articles of Confederation, which, if you remember, is our first government, and Shays' Rebellion is also going to be on there. And Shays' Rebellion showed us that the Articles of Confederation were too weak, that we needed a stronger government to try to control situations like the one that Shays had. So Shays' Rebellion really shows us that we need a stronger government. The Articles of Confederation aren't working. So you're going to need to read about what the Articles of Confederation were and what they weren't. It talks about the Constitutional Convention, about the different plans and balancing the needs of the big states and the needs of the small states, the Virginia plan, which was the big states plan, and the New Jersey plan, which was the small states plan. So we have questions on those about the Constitutional Convention itself, how James Madison is the father of the Constitution because he had the most influence over it. So those are the things that you're going to need to know from Chapter 8. In Chapter 10, we talked about the Bill of Rights, talked about that the Bill of Rights is actually part of the Constitution, that the Bill of Rights was mainly written by James Madison, who's the father of the Constitution, as I stated. And it's going to ask some questions about the First Amendment. I do have regrets in making this test that I didn't have more Bill of Rights questions. I wish that I did. So you need to really understand the First Amendment is going to be asked about. Next thing that is going to be in it, we're going to talk about is Chapter 11. We're going to go back to talking about the Federalists and the differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, and how the Federalists really basically felt like the rich and well-born should be the ones who are running the country, and that their attitudes towards the poor and towards the mob, and their fear about the French Revolution coming to the United States are all things that you need to know about. So studying the Federalists is very important. Also want you to study about how Washington felt about political parties. Washington really didn't like political parties. He didn't want our country to be what it is today as far as, the Democrats and Republicans constantly fighting. He didn't want that. He wanted more compromising in government. Chapter 11 and Chapter 14 both talk about what's called states' rights theory. And in this states' rights theory, states can nullify a law made by the federal government. So Washington, D.C. could pass a law, and then the states can come by and, nullify that law or make that law, in effect, not a law in their state. And we're going to find out that that's not really possible. So that is an aspect that you're going to need to study is the states' rights theory. It's going to keep coming up. The states' rights theory is going to be one of the main things that causes the Civil War. Chapter 11 talks a little bit about the election of 1800. I do have regrets that I didn't talk more about this in class. The election of 1800, has Adams running against Jefferson, and Adams is a Federalist, and Jefferson is a Republican, and finally the Republican wins, and Adams needs to leave office without there being a problem, and it really shows us that we're able to do this in the United States, that we can pass power from one party to another party without there being violence, without there being disruption. Like, that's just the way it is. Everybody needs to respect the election, respect the will of the American people. Chapter 12, one of my favorite chapters, and I know this video is going long, but I really want you to know this stuff. Chapter 12 talks about foreign policy. It's going to ask you a question about Jefferson's embargo policy and who it hurt the most, maybe why the embargo policy was made. It's going to ask you about Washington's views on foreign policy, about how he wanted a foreign policy based on neutrality and isolation. It's also going to give a question about the Battle of New Orleans, which I'm very fascinated with, and I think is very interesting, and you should know the answer to this question. And then finally, it's going to talk about the Louisiana Purchase, which was done by Thomas Jefferson and doubled the size of the United States. I mean, the United States went from being a 2 to a 4. It went from being a 5 to a 10. It doubled the size. So that is like, what are we going to do with all this land is a major aspect to foreign policy. Who did we buy the land from? Why did we buy the land? These are some things that you want to know. So there in 7 minutes talks about the first portion of what's going to be on the exam. I'm going to come back with a second video, and that's going to talk about chapters 13 and 14 and what questions you should expect from there. So I hope that you're studying this weekend. I hope that you're motivated to do a good job. God bless you, and God bless America.